The story begins in California, a place known for sunshine, suburban dreams, and quiet neighborhoods. In the 1970s, families were moving into new homes in Sacramento's growing suburbs. Streets were lined with trim lawns, children played outside, and doors were often left unlocked. There was a sense of safety, a feeling that nothing could go wrong in these peaceful communities. But beneath the calm, something dark was about to unfold. A predator was watching, someone who understood the routines of these families, someone who studied neighborhoods, waiting for the perfect moment. At first, no one could have guessed what was coming. The crimes began small. A burglary here, a strange break-in there. But soon, patterns emerged that left residents terrified. The police faced a chilling mystery, a figure who slipped silently into homes, targeting people where they felt safest behind locked doors. This was not the work of an impulsive criminal. It was someone organized, calculated, and terrifyingly patient. What would later be called one of the most elusive criminal investigations in American history was only just beginning. In the early 1970s, Sacramento was a city in transition. The post-war boom had built countless suburban communities, and new families were eager to move in. But late at night, an unknown prowler crept through these neighborhoods. Residents began reporting strange occurrences, dogs barking without reason, windows left open that had been closed, footsteps heard outside in the dark. At first, these seemed like isolated events, small disturbances in otherwise ordinary lives. But for investigators, these reports began to form a troubling picture. Someone was studying the homes. Someone was planning. Then the situation escalated. The intrusions became bolder. Personal items were taken, photographs disturbed, and objects were moved around, subtle signs meant to show that someone had been there. Fear began to spread. Families who had once felt completely safe now slept uneasily, double-checking their locks and peering outside at every noise. And yet, the figure remained unseen. By the mid-1970s, it was clear that Sacramento was dealing with more than just an ordinary burglar. This person was escalating, gaining confidence, and developing methods that suggested military precision. Police noticed the suspect often seemed to know neighborhoods intimately. He knew escape routes. He knew which houses had dogs. He knew when residents would be home or away. It was as if he'd been there before, studying, rehearsing, memorizing every detail. For investigators, it was infuriating. They could see the outline of a methodical criminal, but they could not catch him. The community began to live in constant fear. Local newspapers reported on the growing threat, and neighborhood watch groups were formed. For the first time, residents who had never locked their doors were now arming themselves with deadbolts, alarms, and weapons. The suburbs no longer felt safe. What made this predator so terrifying was not only the crimes themselves, but the psychological games he played with the community. Reports describe how he seemed to toy with law enforcement. Sometimes he would leave evidence behind that led nowhere. Other times, he would appear to vanish just before officers arrived. Witnesses described seeing a figure running into the night, but details were always inconsistent. A man of medium build, a masked stranger, someone who blended in so well that he could have been anyone. This uncertainty fueled paranoia. Neighbors began to suspect one another. Every jogger, every man walking alone at night, every unfamiliar car parked on the street became a possible suspect. The fear was not only physical, it was psychological, and it gripped entire communities for years. By this time, Sacramento law enforcement faced immense pressure. Citizens demanded answers. Reporters demanded updates. Every new incident increased the frustration. Detectives worked tirelessly, but the suspect stayed one step ahead. Task forces were formed. New investigative techniques were tried. Officers even set up sting operations, hoping to catch the prowler in the act. But nothing worked. The criminal seemed to anticipate their moves, as if he were studying the investigators just as closely as they were studying him. What law enforcement could not yet realize was that they were dealing with someone unlike any criminal they had ever pursued. Someone who would adapt, evolve, and eventually expand his territory far beyond Sacramento. The case was no longer just about a string of break-ins. It was about a predator who had learned to hide in plain sight. Imagine being a family in Sacramento during this time. You come home from work and notice a window slightly ajar, even though you're sure you closed it that morning. You hear a bump in the night, but when you look, nothing is there. You notice footprints in the mud outside your window that don't match your own shoes. Was imagination, or was someone watching? For many families, this became daily life. Parents tried to remain calm for their children, but anxiety lingered in every shadow. Neighborhood meetings were filled with nervous discussions. People swapped rumors, whispered about possible suspects, and made late-night phone calls to police at the smallest noise. The prowler had accomplished something chilling. He had made safety itself feel like an illusion. As months passed, the unknown figure gained a reputation. The public gave him a name that reflected both fear and frustration. At first, he was called the East Area Rapist because of the specific region of California where the attacks occurred. Later, as investigators connected more crimes across the state, his scope became horrifyingly clear. But long before the name Golden State Killer was coined decades later, residents simply knew that someone dangerous was out there, and no one could stop him. Each time law enforcement believed they were close, the suspect vanished again, slipping into the night like smoke. And so, what started as small disturbances grew into one of the largest manhunts California had ever seen. By the late 1970s, the trail was already growing cold. Despite dozens of victims, hundreds of leads, and thousands of man-hours, there were no arrests. The suspect's ability to disappear left investigators questioning their own skills. They wondered if perhaps he was connected to law enforcement, or if he had some kind of specialized training. Meanwhile, the community's trust in safety and in law enforcement itself began to erode. People still locked their doors, but deep down, they knew locks could not stop someone so determined. The story was far from over. In fact, it was only beginning, because this predator was not finished. He was moving, changing, and his crimes would leave a trail that stretched across California for decades. The case would eventually go cold, but when it was finally solved more than 40 years later, it would be through methods no one in the 1970s could have imagined. A tool of science that would forever change the world of criminal investigation. A tool called DNA. The quiet suburbs of Sacramento had transformed into places of suspicion and dread. Families who once trusted their neighborhoods now lived with their curtains drawn. Children who once played in the streets were now kept inside. Each new report deepened the sense of fear. The prowler was no longer an invisible rumor. He was real, and he was escalating. By the late 1970s, his crimes became more frequent and more brazen. He no longer struck randomly. He seemed to choose his targets carefully, learning their schedules, their habits, even their vulnerabilities. For investigators, this was evidence of someone who thrived on control. He didn't rush. He planned. Every move was deliberate, and every crime seemed to be a performance of power. The press began to pick up the story more aggressively. Local newspapers filled with warnings and speculation. Reporters described a masked man who moved with precision, leaving behind shaken survivors and a trail of questions that seemed impossible to answer. Television broadcasts amplified the fear. Viewers watched late-night news reports that warned residents to lock their windows, keep lights on, and never ignore suspicious noises. Anchors spoke with urgency, their words feeding into the growing panic. Sacramento had never seen anything like this before. For the first time in California's history, entire communities began to feel under siege. Law enforcement worked desperately to keep up. Detectives compared notes. Different counties tried to coordinate, but the crime stretched across multiple jurisdictions. One city would experience a wave of incidents, and just as police thought they were making progress, the suspect would vanish, only to appear miles away, terrorizing a new neighborhood. It felt like chasing a shadow. The media began calling him the East Area Rapist, a chilling name that reflected the region he struck and the way he invaded people's most personal spaces. But even as police tried to warn the public, they withheld many details. They didn't want to spark unnecessary panic, and they didn't want the suspect to know how much they truly understood. Still, word spread quickly. People whispered about the attacks in grocery stores, at schools, in church parking lots. Parents exchanged rumors, and children overheard just enough to fuel nightmares. The prowler had become more than a criminal. He had become a ghost story, one that was frighteningly real. What set him apart was his unpredictability. He didn't strike at a set time. He didn't follow a single method. Sometimes weeks passed between incidents, lulling communities into a false sense of safety. And then, without warning, he would strike again. Each attack carried the same message. No one was safe. Law enforcement was under extraordinary pressure. Community meetings often turned hostile, with angry citizens demanding to know why the suspect hadn't been caught. Officers stood before crowded auditoriums, assuring residents that they were doing everything possible. But behind the scenes, frustration grew. The evidence was scattered, inconsistent, and often led to dead ends. Suspect sketches were vague. Eyewitnesses gave conflicting descriptions. Forensics in the 1970s had limited reach. DNA technology was not yet an option. Police were relying on shoe prints, blood types, and fingerprints, but none of these matched anyone in their files. The suspect was methodical in avoiding capture. He wore gloves, masks, and carefully avoided leaving identifiable evidence. At times, it almost seemed as though he was studying police techniques, learning how to stay ahead of them. And perhaps he was. Residents began taking extraordinary precautions. Men organized late-night patrols, walking the streets with flashlights. Families installed new locks and built fences. Sporting goods stores sold out of weapons. Dog adoptions increased. Entire neighborhoods changed their way of life. Yet the prowler adapted. He adjusted his methods to slip past every barrier. Locked doors did not stop him. Guard dogs were avoided. Alarm systems were disabled. Each incident reinforced the chilling truth. He was always watching. The psychological toll was devastating. Survivors spoke of waking up at night in fear, even years later. Entire communities reported symptoms of collective anxiety. People jumped at small sounds. They avoided going out at night. The air itself seemed heavy with paranoia. For law enforcement, the stress was just as severe. Detectives took the case personally. Some couldn't sleep. Others worried constantly about their own families becoming targets. Officers who worked on an investigation described feeling haunted by the suspect's ability to vanish. And yet, the crimes continued. By the late 1970s, as the suspect expanded his territory, something more terrifying emerged. Investigators realized that the prowler wasn't confined to one region. He was mobile. His crimes extended beyond Sacramento, spreading into other counties and eventually across the state. Each jurisdiction collected evidence, but connecting the dots across such vast distances proved difficult. In an era before centralized databases, communication was slow, and files were often buried in cabinets rather than shared efficiently. The suspect exploited this. He knew how to move just far enough to confuse investigators, leaving each police department chasing fragments of a much larger puzzle. The public grew more desperate for answers. Newspapers published articles speculating about the suspect's identity. Some suggested he might be a police officer himself, given his knowledge of procedures. Others believed he was military, pointing to his discipline and physical fitness. But no matter how many theories emerged, the reality remained the same. The prowler was still free. Families begged for closure. Survivors pleaded for justice. Detectives worked overtime, but leads dried up as quickly as they appeared. It was a cat-and-mouse game, and the suspect always seemed to stay one move ahead. For communities across California, the fear became routine. It lingered like a shadow, stretching from city to city, leaving people exhausted and wary. The story had already grown far beyond Sacramento. It was now a statewide crisis. And yet, even as the attacks slowed and eventually stopped in some areas, the mystery only deepened. Who was he? Why had he chosen these neighborhoods? How did he manage to evade capture so perfectly? In the years that followed, speculation would never fade. Every new unsolved crime in California seemed to raise the question. Was it him? The East Area Rapist had become a phantom in the state's history. His reign of fear left scars that lasted decades. And though the crimes eventually went cold, the story was not over. The silence that followed was not peace. It was only the pause before an even darker revelation. Because what no one realized then was that the East Area Rapist was not just one of California's most notorious criminals. He was also connected to another series of unsolved crimes hundreds of miles away. And together, these would form the legacy of a figure later known by another name, one that would haunt California's history forever. The fear that began in Sacramento spread outward like ripples in water. Communities that had once only read about the East Area Rapist in newspapers were now facing the possibility that he might appear on their own streets. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, the attacks expanded into new regions. Each time the crime surfaced, the same haunting details emerged. A masked intruder who moved silently. A figure who slipped through doors and windows, as if barriers meant nothing. A presence that seemed to know too much about the people he targeted. As investigators traced these incidents, they noticed a disturbing evolution. The criminal was becoming more confident. He had learned how to avoid patrol cars. He had mastered the art of disappearing into darkness. His ability to anticipate law enforcement grew sharper with each passing year. The media followed the story closely. Local news anchors spoke in tense tones about the continuing wave of attacks. Newspapers published chilling descriptions of Predator who taunted police, always a step ahead. Editorials criticized law enforcement for failing to stop him. The growing publicity intensified the atmosphere of fear. Families across California began to feel as if they were living under a cloud that stretched from Sacramento to the Bay Area and beyond. What terrified residents most was the randomness. Anyone could be a target. The suspect did not care about age, background, or neighborhood. He studied homes methodically, then struck without mercy. This unpredictability made the fear universal. Parents tucked their children in at night, wondering if a shadow lurked outside. Couples checked their locks again and again. Communities lived in the grip of constant anxiety. For law enforcement, the pressure was overwhelming. Each new county that experienced the crimes brought new detectives into the investigation. But the case files piled higher and higher, with no clear path to resolution. In community meetings, police were often met with anger. Citizens demanded to know why the suspect had not been caught. Some accused law enforcement of incompetence. Others feared corruption, that the criminal might be one of their own. Behind closed doors, detectives worked tirelessly. They followed thousands of leads. They interviewed suspects. They tracked reports of prowlers, break-ins, and unusual behavior. But each time they thought they were close, the trail went cold. The frustration was immense. Detectives who spent years chasing the case later described it as one of the most haunting experiences of their careers. They carried the weight of knowing that each failure meant another family could be targeted. The criminal seemed to thrive on this frustration. He left behind just enough evidence to show he had been there, but never enough to identify him. He was meticulous, careful, and seemingly fearless. The press began describing the case as one of the most baffling in the state's history. The East Area Rapist had become a symbol of terror, an unsolved mystery that seemed destined to remain unsolved forever. As the 1980s unfolded, California was changing. Cities grew larger, technology advanced, and society shifted. But one thing remained constant: the shadow of the unknown predator who still lingered in the state's collective memory. For a time, the crimes appeared to slow. Months passed without reports. Some dared to hope the suspect had stopped or even left the state. But detectives were not so optimistic. They knew predators rarely stop on their own. And they were right. Hundreds of miles away, in Southern California, a new series of crimes began to emerge. These incidents bore chilling similarities to the East Area Rapist. The same signs of careful planning, the same methodical approach, the same terrifying ability to vanish into the night. At first, police did not connect the two. The crimes occurred in different regions, handled by different jurisdictions. But over time, the similarities became impossible to ignore. Investigators began to suspect that the East Area Rapist had moved south, expanding his territory. If this was true, then California was facing not just a regional predator, but a statewide crisis. The media gave these new crimes a different name: the original Night Stalker, another label for a phantom who seemed impossible to catch. For the public, it was a nightmare without end. Just when communities in Northern California thought the danger had passed, residents in the South began living the same fear. Night after night, people kept their lights on, locked their doors, and peered out windows at every sound. Entire neighborhoods lived with the dread of not knowing when or where the predator would strike again. Meanwhile, law enforcement struggled to adapt. The technology of the time simply wasn't advanced enough to solve a case this complex. Forensics offered limited answers. DNA was still years away from becoming a practical tool in investigations. Detectives relied on interviews, surveillance, and the slow process of connecting scattered evidence. It was like piecing together a puzzle without knowing how many pieces were missing. The suspect, however, seemed to understand this. He used the limitations of the time to his advantage. He left no clear fingerprints. He avoided cameras. He exploited every gap in communication between police departments. The toll on survivors and families was devastating. Some left California entirely, hoping to escape the shadow. Others stayed but lived in fear, forever changed by the knowledge that safety could vanish in an instant. The press kept the story alive, reminding the public that the predator was still out there. Each new anniversary brought fresh headlines, urging people to remain cautious and urging investigators not to give up. But as years passed, the crimes eventually stopped, or at least, no new ones were connected to him. And then silence. The predator, who had terrorized California for more than a decade, seemed to disappear. Some speculated he had been arrested for another crime under a different name. Others believed he might have died. Many suspected he had simply grown older and stopped on his own. But the truth was unknown. For investigators, the silence was maddening. The case files remained unsolved. Families of victims were left without answers. Detectives retired without closure, carrying the burden of unfinished work. By the 1990s, the East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker were infamous names in California's history. But no one had connected them as the same man. Not yet. It would take decades, advances in science, and a revolutionary new technique before the pieces would finally fall into place. Until then, the case became one of the nation's most haunting cold cases. A mystery whispered about at dinner tables, dissected in news articles, and studied by generations of detectives. The shadow remained. The name remained. And the question endured. Who was he? The answer would not come quickly. It would not come easily. But it would come, and when it did, it would rewrite the future of criminal investigation forever. As the 1980s came to a close, the trail of the mysterious predator had gone cold. The crime stopped as suddenly as they had begun, leaving only silence and questions in their wake. For families across California, the absence of new attacks did not erase the fear. It lingered like an echo, a reminder that the man responsible was still out there somewhere. Survivors carried the weight of their trauma every day. Communities carried the scars of years spent in fear. Law enforcement was left with shelves of case files, boxes of evidence, and unanswered questions. Detectives who had spent years chasing leads watched as the investigation stalled. Some retired with the frustration of knowing they had never solved the case. Others continued to carry the mystery with them, hoping for a breakthrough that never seemed to come. By the 1990s, the East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker had become names known mostly to investigators, journalists, and the families of victims. For many in the general public, the stories faded into the background of California's history. But for those directly affected, the pain was never far away. The crimes had become a cold case, and cold cases are heavy things. They sit in the background, unsolved, waiting for a spark that might one day bring them back to life. In the 1990s, forensic science was undergoing major changes. DNA technology was beginning to revolutionize the way investigators approached unsolved crimes. Where once police relied on fingerprints, shoe impressions, and witness accounts, now they had the possibility of using genetic evidence to identify suspects. It was slow at first. DNA testing was expensive, time-consuming, and required significant samples. But as the decade went on, the science became more precise, and the potential became clear. For the unsolved crimes in California, DNA offered new hope. Evidence that had sat in storage for years was re-examined. Biological material collected decades earlier once thought to be useless, was now a possible key. Investigators began to realize something shocking. The East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker were not two different criminals. They were the same man. This discovery reframed the entire case. What had once seemed like two separate reigns of terror were revealed to be the work of one predator who had moved across California, leaving devastation in his path. The new name that would eventually stick came later: the Golden State Killer. A single title for a man whose crimes had spanned decades and regions. For families of victims, the news was bittersweet. On one hand, the crimes were being linked together, proving what many had long suspected. On the other, it underscored the enormity of what they were up against. This was not an isolated figure who disappeared after a few years. This was someone who had terrorized communities statewide for over a decade. As the case entered the 2000s, more investigators picked it up. Fresh eyes examined the old evidence. New detectives, armed with new tools, tried to pick up where their predecessors had left off. The public began to hear about the case again. True crime documentaries, books, and news reports revisited the story. Each retelling brought renewed attention, keeping the mystery alive. People speculated about the identity of the Golden State Killer. Was he a former cop? A military veteran? A neighbor who had gone unnoticed all those years? Theories flourished, but answers remained elusive. By this point, DNA evidence had confirmed connections between dozens of crimes. Investigators knew they were dealing with one man. They had his genetic profile, but without a name to attach to it, the case remained stuck. Traditional methods of running DNA through criminal databases brought no matches. The Golden State Killer had never been arrested for a crime that required him to give a DNA sample. He had managed to live an ordinary life on the surface, avoiding the systems that might have revealed him. Detectives continued to chase leads. They interviewed hundreds of potential suspects. They followed up on tips that poured in from the public. But again and again, the results were the same: dead ends. Meanwhile, survivors and families of victims continued to wait. Each passing year made justice feel more distant. Some feared the killer would die before ever being identified, taking his secrets with him. But science was about to take another leap forward, one that would change not just this case, but the entire future of criminal investigation. The rise of commercial DNA databases, used by people to explore their ancestry and family trees, opened a new possibility. For the first time, investigators could use genetic genealogy to find relatives of an unknown suspect. By building family trees and tracing connections, detectives could work backward from distant relatives to identify the person responsible. It was a revolutionary idea, one that had never been attempted on such a high-profile cold case before. But as the Golden State Killer investigation stalled, it became clear that this new technique might be the only way forward. Behind the scenes, a small team of determined investigators began experimenting with this approach. They uploaded the DNA profile of the unknown suspect into public genealogy databases, searching for matches with distant relatives. Slowly, painstakingly, they began to build family trees. Names, marriages, children, addresses. All the details of ordinary family life became clues in a decades-old manhunt. The process was complex, requiring immense patience and skill. But little by little, the picture began to come into focus. After decades of frustration, investigators were closing in on a suspect. The man they were looking for was hiding in plain sight, living a quiet life, never expecting that science would one day unmask him. The Golden State Killer's silence had lasted more than 30 years. But now, after decades of fear, trauma, and unanswered questions, the story was about to change forever. The past was catching up. The walls were closing in, and the predator who had once terrorized California was about to face the light of justice. The investigation that had stretched across 4 decades was finally moving again. For years, the Golden State Killer had been nothing more than a shadow, a figure who had disappeared into the past, seemingly untouchable. But with the rise of genetic genealogy, detectives now held a new kind of weapon, one that the killer could never have anticipated. The process began quietly. Investigators took the DNA profile developed from crime scene evidence and uploaded it into public genealogy databases. These were places where ordinary people submitted their genetic information to trace their ancestry, discover family histories, and connect with distant relatives. No direct match appeared. The killer had never submitted his DNA, but investigators weren't looking for him directly. They were looking for anyone who might share a portion of his genetic code, distant cousins, great-great-grandparents, or long-lost relatives who might unknowingly hold the key to his identity. It was a slow, methodical process. Each partial match represented a branch of a family tree. Investigators, alongside genealogists, began to trace those branches backward, filling in names, marriages, and children. One branch connected to another, then another, until entire family histories unfolded on paper. Piece by piece, the web of connections grew tighter. And within that web, one name began to stand out: Joseph James DeAngelo. At first glance, he was an ordinary man, a husband, a father, a grandfather. He had lived in California for years, blending into suburban life just like the communities he once terrorized. He had worked as a police officer in the 1970s, giving him knowledge of law enforcement procedures. Later, he held jobs that drew no suspicion. But when detectives dug deeper, the details aligned with chilling precision. His age matched, his history matched, his movements during the years of the crimes matched the geography of the attacks. He had lived near many of the neighborhoods where incidents occurred. And most importantly, his family connections aligned perfectly with the genealogy tree that investigators had painstakingly constructed. Still, suspicion was not enough. Investigators needed absolute proof. They needed his DNA. Carefully, quietly, they began surveillance. Detectives watched DeAngelo's home, following him as he went about his daily life. He appeared unremarkable, just another retiree living in a quiet Sacramento suburb. He shopped, drove, and lived like anyone else. But investigators knew what they were really looking for, something he would leave behind. Patience paid off. Detectives collected discarded items from his trash, objects he had unknowingly touched. These were sent to lab, compared against the DNA from the decades-old crime scenes. When the results came back, they confirmed what investigators had suspected. The DNA was a match. After more than 40 years, the identity of the Golden State Killer was no longer a mystery. Joseph James DeAngelo was the man who had terrorized California. The breakthrough sent shockwaves through law enforcement. Detectives who had spent their careers chasing the shadow finally had a name and a face. Some cried. Others felt a weight lift off their shoulders. For decades, this case had haunted them, and now, justice was finally within reach. The arrest operation was carefully planned. Officers surrounded DeAngelo's home, ensuring that the man who had eluded them for so long would not escape again. Neighbors watched in disbelief as police moved in. Many had lived next to DeAngelo for years, never suspecting that their quiet neighbor was one of the most notorious criminals in American history. When officers approached, DeAngelo was calm. He offered little resistance. After years of silence, the predator who had once thrived on instilling fear was finally caught. The news broke quickly. Headlines across the nation announced the stunning development. The Golden State Killer had been identified and arrested after more than 4 decades. Television broadcasts replayed footage of the arrest, showing a man who looked nothing like the terrifying figure people had imagined. He was older now, frail in appearance, yet behind that exterior was a man who had once spread terror across an entire state. For survivors and families of victims, the moment was overwhelming. Some wept at the news, finally receiving the closure they had waited for. Others felt conflicted, torn between relief and anger that it had taken so long. Many were stunned that the man who had changed their lives forever had been living quietly among them, blending in as if nothing had happened. Communities across California reacted with a mixture of shock and relief. The name Joseph James DeAngelo became known worldwide. His mugshot appeared on screens and front pages, a stark contrast to the faceless phantom he had once been. But even as the arrest brought answers, it also raised new questions. How had he managed to escape detection for so long? How had a man who once worked in law enforcement lived undetected for decades? What secrets still remained in the shadows of his past? Law enforcement held press conferences, outlining the details of the investigation. They explained how genetic genealogy had finally cracked the case, crediting the persistence of investigators and the revolutionary power of science. They emphasized that this was a turning point, not only for this case, but for the future of solving cold cases everywhere. The arrest marked the beginning of a new chapter. The long pursuit was over, but the trial, the testimony, and the reckoning with the past were still to come. For the victims' families, the arrest did not erase the pain. Nothing could, but it did bring a measure of justice. It proved that no matter how much time passed, the truth could still be uncovered. And for law enforcement, it was a victory decades in the making. The patience, persistence, and refusal to give up had finally paid off. The Golden State Killer had lived in silence, convinced he had escaped. But in the end, science reached into the past, pulled him into the present, and forced him to face justice. The shadow that had haunted California for so long finally had a name, and the man who had once believed he could hide forever was finally behind bars. The arrest of Joseph James DeAngelo marked the end of one of the longest and most terrifying manhunts in American history. But the story was not finished. After decades of silence, the man once known only as a shadow now had to face the weight of justice. In the days following his capture, the news spread rapidly. Television networks replayed footage of DeAngelo being led away in handcuffs. Newspapers across the country ran headlines announcing that the Golden State Killer had been caught. For many, it felt surreal. After more than 40 years, the phantom had a face. Neighbors who had lived beside him for years were stunned. They described him as quiet, reserved, sometimes irritable, but never outwardly threatening. To them, he was just another retiree living an ordinary suburban life. The revelation that he was responsible for a decades-long reign of terror shocked everyone who thought they knew him. For survivors and families of victims, the arrest was both a relief and a painful reminder. Many spoke publicly about the years of trauma, the sleepless nights, and the lingering fear that had followed them long after crimes ended. Some wept with gratitude that justice had finally come. Others expressed anger that it had taken so long. In court, DeAngelo appeared as a frail man, wheeled and wearing an orange prison uniform. It was a stark contrast to the terrifying figure who had once outsmarted police and terrorized communities. The sight of him in custody brought a strange sense of closure to many. He no longer seemed larger than life. He was simply an old man facing the consequences of his past. The trial process was long and complex. Prosecutors from multiple counties worked together, presenting evidence that connected DeAngelo to crimes across the state. The sheer scale of his offenses made the case one of the largest in California's history. DNA evidence formed the backbone of the prosecution. The genetic genealogy that had led to his arrest was now paired with decades of forensic work, tying DeAngelo to crime scenes stretching back to the 1970s. Witness testimony from survivors added powerful voices to the courtroom, reminding everyone that the case was not just about statistics or evidence, but about real lives that had been forever changed. In 2020, DeAngelo chose to plead guilty to multiple charges in order to avoid the death penalty. The plea deal required him to admit, in detail, to the crimes he had committed. One by one, prosecutors read to the long list of charges, and DeAngelo responded in a quiet voice, acknowledging his guilt. The courtroom was filled with survivors and families who had waited decades for this moment. Some cried as they listened. Others stared at DeAngelo with unwavering eyes, refusing to let him hide from what he had done. When it came time for victims to speak, the room was filled with powerful testimony. Survivors described the lifelong impact of his crimes, the fear, the trauma, the broken trust, and the resilience it took to rebuild their lives. Families of victims shared stories of loved ones lost, demanding that DeAngelo hear their pain and recognize the devastation he had caused. For many, speaking directly to him was an act of reclaiming power. For decades, he had controlled the narrative through fear and silence. Now, it was their turn to speak, and he had no choice but to listen. DeAngelo himself showed little emotion during these proceedings. At one point, he offered a short apology, muttering the words, "I'm truly sorry," but for many it fell hollow. The damage he had inflicted could never be undone by words. Ultimately, DeAngelo was sentenced to multiple life terms without the possibility of parole. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars, his freedom stripped away just as he had once stripped it from so many others. The sentence was not just about punishment. It was about closure. For survivors and families, it marked the end of a nightmare that had stretched on for more than 4 decades. For law enforcement, it was a resolution of a case that had haunted generations of detectives. Beyond the courtroom, the case left a lasting impact on the field of criminal investigation. The use of genetic genealogy to identify DeAngelo was groundbreaking. It proved that even the coldest cases could be solved if evidence was preserved and science continued to advance. Since his arrest, genetic genealogy has been used to solve numerous other cold cases, bringing justice to families who had long given up hope. The case also sparked important conversations about privacy, ethics, and the balance between public safety and personal data. Some question whether law enforcement should have access to genealogy databases. Others argue that the greater good, bringing justice to victims and closing decades-old cases, outweighed those concerns. For California, the case served as a reminder of resilience. Communities that had once lived in fear could now look back, knowing that the man who terrorized them was finally caught. Survivors who had carried their trauma for years could now see justice delivered. The legacy of the case is both tragic and transformative. Tragic because of the pain and fear inflicted on so many lives. Transformative because it reshaped the way cold cases are approached, offering hope to families who might otherwise never see justice. The story of the Golden State Killer is ultimately one of persistence. For 40 years, the case remained unsolved, but investigators never stopped searching. Survivors never stopped demanding answers, and science never stopped advancing. In the end, time did not protect DeAngelo. Age did not shield him. Silence did not erase what he had done. The truth emerged, as it so often does, no matter how long it takes. Today, Joseph James DeAngelo sits in prison, living out his remaining years behind bars. The communities he once terrorized have moved forward, carrying scars but also carrying strength. The story leaves behind lessons for law enforcement, for society, and for future generations. It teaches that justice may be delayed, but with persistence, it is never truly denied. It shows the power of science to uncover truths once thought unreachable. And it reminds us that the fight for justice is never wasted, no matter how long it takes. For the victims, the story will always be personal. Their courage, their resilience, and their voices remain the most important part of this history. For the world, it is a reminder that even the darkest mysteries can be solved, that the shadows of the past can be pierced, and that one man's reign of fear can end in the light of truth. The case is closed. The phantom is unmasked. And the Golden State Killer is no more.